If you've ever followed a discussion on Twitter about forecasting of renewable energy, about electric vehicles and whether their emissions are more or less than internal combustion, about electric vehicles versus fuel cells, about the future of trucking, long distance trucking, sooner or later, you'll end up at some posts by my guest today on cleaning up, Auke Hoekstra. Auke is a researcher at the Eindhoven University. He also runs his own small consulting business, Zenmo Solutions, and he's an authority on everything renewable energy. Let's bring Auke into the conversation.
Hi, Michael.
Good evening, Auke.
Hi, Michael.
Very
Great
good
to see you again.
And it's fabulous to see you in person, because on Twitter and when we talk on the telephone, I forget that you really look like an energy guru should look like. I have this little rubbishy beard, but you really look the part.
Thank you.
And I hope you've got with you, because we're both in Europe and it's the evening, so we're both allowed to have a drink. Cheers. And I've done a few of these with Australians and Americans, and it's sort of very embarrassing because they sit there drinking water and coffee, and I'm drinking beer. But there you go. That's the way it rolls.
Now, when you're close to Belgium or something, you love beer, I would say. So.
Oh, don't get me started. I should do this with a duffel, but this is actually alcohol free. It's net zero. I'm going to be driving later. Yes. Now, we met, as with so many of my energy friends now, on what is colloquially known as energy Twitter.
Yes.
There's a bunch of people very active, and we really get stuck into the details of discussions. And your name, your posts, we're talking now probably 10 years ago, just kept coming to my attention. And so I first became aware of you as this, this guy who was kind of always right on Twitter. And you were doing some really interesting things on tracking forecasts of renewable energy against outturn, which I was also doing, but not I was behind you. How did you get into that?
Yes. By the way, did you know you were one of the first people who sort of discovered me? I was still there was nobody who knew me on Twitter when you sort of got interested in me, and I was also in Holland. I was still trying to make my mark, so to speak, trying to convince people that even though I lacked the credentials back then, I was thinking about it. And you immediately saw, wow, this guy, he's onto something. So yeah, I like to see you as someone who's very good at spotting trends. and in my case, you immediately picked out the stuff where I was right.
Well, it was very notable that, a lot of the people who are authoritative and they kind of point to their papers and their work, they are with universities, they're with companies, they're kind of known. And then there was you, whose work that you were pointing to was a blog. And then there was a sort of, I tried to find out a bit more about you, and I found that you had just been on a sabbatical and so on. And then you had been doing some R programming with your wife, and it was kind of a very non-traditional background for a real guru and an expert. But that was what I found. But so let's go back to that period. What were you actually doing sort of with your time, and why were you doing what you were doing?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, I was a project leader for internet projects, and I've seen how the PC came, and I sort of saw that, and how the internet came, and how the mobile phone came, and how the smartphone came, and all the time I was one of the first people saying, look, this is logical, this is going to be the next big thing. But I got bored, basically. So I took a sabbatical, and indeed, together with my wife, who is a programmer, I did I learned how to do better statistical modeling, that sort of stuff. And I basically found out that solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles were very predictable, fast growing phenomena, which were sort of not given their due, I think, in the bigger community, EAA, etc. And so from there, I basically chose after the sabbatical, I'll work on this. So I had no background whatsoever. So I
Right.
wrote a couple of
And
books.
which year was the sabbatical? Which year was all of that kind of?
13 years ago. So that's 2007, 2008.
So so before that you were doing IT.
Yes.
But then around 2007, 8, you just said, this is all old stuff, boring, but there's this new thing. And I think I see something that other people are not seeing in terms of what's going to happen next, right?
Yeah. And I had enough money on the bank basically to try something new. And I thought, let's make my life worthwhile basically by choosing a mission that, and I also thought that there must be some way to, earn a living there. It turned out it was not so easy in the beginning. Right now it's quite doable, but in the beginning it was quite small. You also noticed probably that when you started BNEF, it was harder then than it is now.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I started BNEF, even if we go back to 2004, 2005, even when people were very interested, corporates were very interested, banks were interested, they had no budget for information services.
Exactly.
That really came, 2006, 7, 8, 9. I mean, actually, if you think it was hard when you started, you should have tried it in 2004, 5.
Yeah. Hats off to you.
but just a question though, did you come to the solar and all the energy stuff? There's a few different motivations and I'm always fascinated. Was it intellectually interesting? Did you think I'm going to make some money? Or was it the environment and the planet? What were the sort of underlying motivations for choosing the sector?
Yeah, the money was basically something I thought there should be some way to make some money, but it was absolutely not important for me. I was making very good money before that. I'm not making that kind of money now, and I don't need to.
Right. So not the money.
So the first reason was really the environmental angle. I learned from my elders, basically from my mother and my father, that we should ditch fossil fuels someday, and we'll ruin the planet basically. But it's probably not going to change because we being who we are. And then I found out, hey, but it is going to change. Let's change it quicker. And then it also became a sort of intellectual puzzle.
And it's interesting because the guest, actually the episode has just gone live today as we film this. It is episode, I think, 12 with Ramiz Naam, who's another of the energy Twitter, who spotted these trends. It's quite often people, myself as well, who came out of an IT background who see, Moore's law is like, well, yeah, obviously. And then you look at solar and it's obvious. But if you come out of oil and gas, solar's astonishing cost reduction.
Exactly. I really have a very strong feeling.
Yes.
That ICT guys, for them, this feels native, all these learning curves and etc. And for the energy world, the traditional energy world, this is very alien. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I still get asked, when does the experience curve in solar stop? And I'm like, no, it doesn't stop. But of course, if you're, digging coal, by the time once you decide where to dig and you build your railway, that's it. Your costs are largely going to remain the same. For it's just very, very different sort of economics.
Exactly.
And so you did the sabbatical, and then you were. I mean, what was your plan of action, sort of coming out of that? Because then, you still needed to get engaged and build what a
so
reputation.
Basically, I had a very how it went is very simple. Let's just cut to the chase, and we can get into the super interesting topics that that people like even more than my background maybe. I wrote a couple of books in Dutch because I thought, well, when I do that, people will sort of believe that I'm an expert. Fortunately, they got published by the ministry, and then people believed I was an expert. I did the rounds speaking at Congress, etc. Then I got hired by the largest grid operator because they said, we really want to know what the impact's going to be of all this new stuff on our grid. And I knew the CEO back then. So swell. And then I found out, wow, this university, for example, Eindhoven, they're finding out stuff that's way ahead, basically, of where the grid operator is and where the energy companies are. I should be there because there is where the newest stuff is happening. So I said to the grid operator, could I please be at the university? You still pay me quite handsomely, actually, but I'm going to start a PhD. So I became the best paid PhD, I think, from the University of Eindhoven. But nevertheless, it worked. And then I basically said, okay, I can't keep doing this on the money of the grid operator. I'll start my own company. So that's how I now make my living. And I'm going to try to start some new initiatives at the TU Eindhoven. So now that succeeded. So now I have 35 people potentially, because we're still in the starting phase. At least they're funded, working on this new project of mine, and I'm doing my own consulting company. So that's sort of how
and that big project is something called Neon.
Right.
Give me the sketch of Neon. Give everybody our audience a sketch, and then we'll probably come back to it in more detail, because I want to get into some of the topics that you've kind of dug into along that route. But Neon, 35 researchers. Are they all hired? I noticed you were hiring until recently.
We've only hired 10 or so far.
We'll put a link into the show notes, so if anybody can, if anybody wants to, then they can.
If you have a good background in sustainable energy and you're really interested in modeling it and sort of getting a grasp of how things will go from here, then I think it should be interesting for you to apply.
And what is the purpose of Neon? What are you modeling with Neon?
Okay. Now, basically, we had the big kickoff actually last week, and it went fabulously. It was really, really nice. And basically, the central point of Neon is, let's bring together researchers from very different backgrounds. So people who know about psychology, people who know about sociology and where society wants to go, people who know about regulation, and then of course the large contingent that's always there of let's say the beta scientists, the people who know about windmills, about solar energy, etc., etc., etc. So we made a group of 20 professors basically in 20 companies from all these different angles, and the whole point of Neon is, let's try to bring all these fields, all these viewpoints together in a model that can enable, basically, instead of writing it down, I call it quantified narrative, instead of just writing it down as a story.
Right. But it's a narrative of what? What are you modeling?
How we get away from fossil fuels. And so the tagline is, Neon lights the way to zero emission energy and mobility.
For the Netherlands, for Holland, or for everything?
Officially, yes. That's what we have the money for. But we want to look broader.
Okay, so I'm going to cut. I have a kind of shorthand when I explain to people what you do. I say basically, he's building a Holland simulator to run energy scenarios. Is that a fair description?
That's a fair description. Actually, my last master student said, when I started my master thesis, I was very unsure how, I didn't feel like I had a grip on the energy transition, on the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and electric vehicles, etc. And now I feel like I made a cockpit and I'm the pilot now. So now I can choose how this energy transition goes basically in the computer.
And you're using agent-based modeling yourself. Is exactly. That all of Neon is going to be based on, or does everybody use their own methodology?
No. The agent-based modeling is going to be the way to bring everybody together at least.
So tell us, because what I'm trying to do with these conversations is, bridge between, enormous expertise and, anybody out there who's just interested, and, some people are relatively new to all of this. So tell me, what is an agent-based model and what is a not agent-based model, and why what you're doing is better?
Yeah, so agent-based modeling is a quite recent development, actually. It's sometimes called even a third way of doing science, although that's maybe a little bit big. But the idea is that you basically make a duplicate of the real world in a computer, like a strategy game, basically, or a computer game, and you sort of replay the reality in different scenarios, because of course you can replay the world. We can run a simulation, we can build a new world and simulate how the world could. So we have to simulate in the computer. So we make a copy a simplified copy of reality in the computer. And what is, I would say, the core of agent-based modeling is that everything that happens because entities, mostly humans, but can also be cars or machines,
Yeah.
they live their life. I would say that they take their own decisions based on their own environment, and the whole entire system basically emerges from that. So it's very different from a usual model where you basically say, this is how it works, and now let's try different settings. I don't know how it works. I just say, Michael is going to buy, finally going to buy an electric vehicle, because now there's going to be this new 4x4 which seats 7 children or something. So now he finally has a chance. So now he can make, so this is an agent that's basically close to you. There's another agent. So,
yeah. And then presumably you do say, right, how many people are there like Michael or something like that?
Exactly. So we make a population, right?
Yeah.
That resembles the real world, and it can be very heterogeneous, right? So it can be, we can have thousands of different types of people, not millions or billions, but thousands at least. So Michael is basically representative then for, let's say, 10,000 people in the Netherlands that are close to Michael, etc. And everybody has its own position. That's also something that most models cannot do. So for example, if you live in the country, you will buy other cars than when you live in the center of the city, right? So positioning makes, and also the grid, for example, makes a big difference, of course, where you are on what problems you cause on the grid, etc., makes for renewable energy, makes a lot of difference where everything happens. So a windmill can be an agent. And if the windmill is in the middle of Holland, it will produce much less energy than it's in the middle of the North Sea, for example. So positioning is spatially explicit, as they say in modeling terms. And then it's temporally explicit. So it happens over time with short time steps of 15 minutes or something. And you can really see how this world evolves and how people make different decisions every 15 minutes.
And you must see sort of clusters of behaviors. Some people who have who put together I don't know, this many holidays with this sort of vehicle, but they want to live in that sort of apartment or that. And of course, this classical model, the systems dynamics type model, well, they tend to sort of say, well, everybody replaces their car after 15.2 years. And then they say, well, if that was 14 years, but they don't.
Exactly.
There's one group replaces it every year and another one that keeps it for 30 years, right?
Exactly. So if you really model those early adopters and those laggards, but even more specifically, if you find that people who are, so this is exactly the sort of dynamics that you can find with agent-based models. And in system dynamics, for example, you have to aggregate into a few kind of, so there's not Michael, there's basically, let's say 1 or 2 or 3 types of consumers, and they have all the same behavior, and that's it. And by the way, if I may, economic models, most economic models are still equilibrium models. So system is even simpler, I would say, in a way, than system dynamics models. And you have this rational actor, you know? So this guy, so basically we have one consumer, he knows his utility function, he knows exactly what he wants, he knows exactly where to get it, he knows the exact entire market, he's completely rational. And this is not how it works.
Right. And you're going to tell me his name is William Nordhaus, and he makes these rational decisions.
No. I'm not completely sure what exactly the modeling that Nordhaus does is, but I think so. Yes. By the way,
yes, I think. Well, they're certainly rational. It's about these integrated assessment models are based on some kind of a rational actor adding resources to an energy system. But okay, so that's what you're doing. But along the way, you came across and you've been, immersed in other people's forecasts. And I'm thinking in particular of the IEA. You call it the EAR, but that's in Dutch. So we call it IEA, International Energy Agency. And a few years back, I don't know when you first did it, but you basically it was palpable that you were just hugely unimpressed. And you did this analysis, which is actually an absolute classic. There's a whole genre now, which I've contributed to, an analysis showing, look, this is the forecast and this is the outturn, and then there's a new forecast and then there's a new outturn. So how did you get into doing that?
Well, actually, the IEA, I should say. I'm pronouncing it right now. IEA.
IEA, yes.
Yeah, the IEA was one of the parties that really got me into the energy transition, because during this sabbatical, I found their forecast, and I found a book published by the IEA, or at least sponsored by the IEA, by a professor, which explains learning curves, which were completely at odds with their regular forecasts. And then I thought, oh my God, I know this. I know this from internet and all these other, this is the big experts who tell things are never going. So the IEA was actually instrumental in as a sort of as a way to say, at least I know that they're doing it wrong, so I should be doing differently. Yeah.
Right, and you know, it's funny because I go back to the early days of new energy finance, 2004, 5, 6. And I mean, these IEA forecasts at the time were, it was essentially that renewable energy, modern renewable, not hydro, so wind, solar, bio, geo, all that stuff, would be, you know, 1% of electricity or less forever. I mean,
yeah,
that was
exactly.
Flat line.
And they would say they would say such nice things about them, like let's treat them very nicely, but they will be small forever.
Yeah, and then, but it's not. I want to make sure that everybody realizes it's not just the IEA. I mean, it is the Americans have one called the EIA, the Energy Information Administration. But it was also all the big oil companies. They were all producing these forecasts, saying
everybody.
You know, they were saying, some of them were saying until very recently that you know, all of this stuff doesn't add up to a hill of beans. And what was funny was, I remember around 2007 or 8, these forecasts were so bad that I knew, see, because new energy finance, we were tracking financings, which is a leading indicator of installations, right? Because you finance, you make a final investment decision before you build. So we knew what was in the pipeline, and it was bigger than what some of these forecasters were saying was going to happen in like 10 years later or 20 years later. And I was like, look, I can list the projects that prove your forecasts are wrong. You know, as I say, in 1 year, they're going to be wrong by 10 years or whatever.
Yeah, so basically we agree 100%, and you were 5 years earlier or something. So hats off to you.
But you were but you put this beautiful graphic together, which is the grandfather of all the analysis, all of these.
Now, what I basically did is I said, they're looking from a fossil perspective, how much energy gets burned in total, etc. That's not how this works. If you look at solar, basically the same thing you were doing with the pipeline. If you look at solar, you have to say we have an industry that can build an X number of solar panels. And this industry that builds X number of solar panels per year, then, is this industry going to grow? Has it grown? Or is it going down? And if you sort of transformed the IEA predictions and plotted them on that kind of thinking, because you could easily
so you took the sort of first derivative, didn't you? You sort of said, okay,
exactly.
And actually that was the brilliance of it, because going back to my early days as an analyst in the mid 80s, drawing a chart of showing forecasts and outturns. I call them hedgehog charts, because quite often they kind of they go like this, and they look like they've got spines like a porcupine or a hedgehog. But what was great about what you did was you took the derivative, right? You said, okay, well, because everybody was talking cumulative. Exactly. They were all talking about cumulative solar. There'd be this much solar, there'd be that much solar in place. And what you said is, yeah, but the assumption behind that is that they're only adding this much year by year. And you proved that it was going down. So you proved that they were assuming that these industries were all about to go into a massive recession, wind and solar, both of them. And that was the brilliance, to show that that's what they were founding it on.
Exactly. And that's also, I think, what people didn't understand, that if you build solar panels, you know, if you have a factory building solar panels, if this factory doesn't go bankrupt, it will add a certain output every year. So taking the first derivative is actually very close to how the world operates in solar. you know, solar is not cumulative. Solar is how big are the plants going to be this year and next year, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at it from that perspective, if you take the derivative, it was very close to the actual way the industry worked. Then all the predictions became completely nonsensical.
Completely nonsensical. And even a few years ago, I think it was only 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago at most, the EIA forecast for solar was essentially 40 gigawatts globally to be added forever, or for the next 20, 30 years, each year. And I knew that there were single companies in China that had an investment plan that was, you know, approved by their board, and that was to build factories with outputs of something like 30 or 40 gigawatts of silicon or cells or whatever. So single players in China were going to be outputting more than the entire forecast for the globe in these forecasts. So anyway, we agree that they were completely ridiculous.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Michael, but you're great friends now with the IEA. Doesn't it feel strange?
Sorry?
Doesn't it feel strange?
Well, not really, no, because I tell you what, they have always done an absolutely brilliant job of herding the basic data. Everything you do, everything I do, we could not do it without the IEA working with countries, because it's not just that they gather the data. They have to work with the companies to explain the data, to normalize the data, and then year in and year out. So that was always brilliant. And then their output is not just a single scenario. I mean, I used to get very upset with them when they talked about reference scenario, right? And then they moved to the reference scenario is always this one that no policies ever change, because it's kind of what happens if you don't change. Well, if your scenario for the future is based on your existing policy, then any sector which is new is always disadvantaged. There's a systematic problem. But then they did new policies, and then they've done the technology futures, they've done the sustainable development scenarios, and I think that they have gotten on the forecasting, which they call scenarios, but it's clearly forecasting. They've gotten much better. I still think it's conservative, but of course, you know, and I know, by the way, we have a new target, which is, we've spent years sort of pushing for the IEA, and by the way, also the oil companies to base their work on current costs and on much more realistic assumptions. And then we've discovered the whole world of the IPCC modeling, where the IEA is not actually pessimistic about clean energy. It's absolutely at the bleeding edge of optimism compared to what the IPCC modelers are coming up with.
Yeah. Right? So in my worldview, we now have, let's say, 3 kind of actors. The first is, and I would just like to single them out because I think it's really important.
Modelers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So first we have, let's say, the IPCC, which basically uses science that is very old and models that are very large to predict the future based on assumptions that are completely outdated. Then we have, let's say, the EAA, we have the energy world, I would say the energy community.
IEA,
the energy community is much less behind the curve, I would say. So therefore more optimistic in our world. But still, I would like to say that I think what is most important, I would like, if readers are listening, apply if you agree to NEON, because I think the future where we're going to make the biggest difference is parties that look ahead and say, look, we have those learning curves. How can we actually speed up those learning curves? So not only are we going to be optimistic or at least realistic, but also we're going to find out what are the tipping points that we can use to sort of make this system completely out of whack as soon as possible, because we need that. We need tipping points. And so the EAA, I would say, is conservative and is sort of rejecting tipping points. And we actually need to look for those tipping points and actually need to exploit them. We really need that. So I would say we need to be sort of like the destabilizing modelers that find out how can you make the system change as quickly as possible.
Well, you're opening up. I mean, there's a whole a fascinating question about whether we are sort of modeling the future or building the future. And of course, in a chaotic system, it may actually be where modeling it might require infinite resources, but changing it might only require finite resources. So maybe we should just stop kidding ourselves that we're modeling. And certainly, I mean, it's what's funny for me, because I came, like you, I was not an expert. I came out of IT, .com, all sorts of things. And the idea that I might actually be in a position of sufficient influence that what I say about a sector changes the trajectory of that sector is amusing.
Yes. So basically, that's actually, you always have a way of framing things better than I do. So the framing should be, we have the science that is very much behind the curve. Unfortunately, we have the EAR, the energy community, that is a little bit more current, but still sort of lagging a little bit in predictive power. And then we have the people who are actually going to make the future happen by predicting it. We're going to change the future. That's the whole point of our models. Yes.
So around the time that I started to really kind of get under the skin of these forecasts, 2005, 6, 7, there was a forecast of wind and solar by Greenpeace. And I loved it because it was completely bonkers. These, you know, the curve went shooting up like this. And I liked it because, not because I agreed with it, but because you then had all of the conventional modelers down here saying nothing ever changes. And you had Greenpeace going, oh, it's going to go like this. And I could go somewhere in between and say, well, this is what I think is going to happen. And I didn't seem like the crazy people because there was crazy Greenpeace.
So Greenpeace, yep, they sort of opened an Overton, they moved the Overton window.
They moved the Overton window, and they served a fantastic function of the, you know, of the activist, you know, whatever. Here's the funny thing though. There was also about 7 or 8, 10 years after that, which would have been, you know 2015 time, 2016, there was an analysis of whose forecasts had been the best.
Greenpeace.
And it was Greenpeace. And
I didn't want to jump. I didn't want to jump.
It was joke, Greenpeace. But, yeah. And I spoke to the modeler, just to come back to the point about whether we're modeling or building the future. And I asked him, I said, well, you know, really, you know, as the French say, chapeau, hats off. You really did a good job. He said, oh, no, we didn't forecast anything. We said what we wanted to have happen, and then we went out and we worked as activists to make it happen.
But still, what you always see, I love it, but what you always see with learning curves, with exponential developments, people collectively underestimate it. So it's basically, yeah, if I was sort of a betting person, I would also always bet on the highest forecast. Tony Seba, let's not go there, but the highest, more or less realistic forecast, and they would usually be right.
Well, but yes, although, you know, since you've raised his name, I mean, the problem with that only is that you have to have numbers that add up and stuff that isn't patently stupid, because anybody can pull a high forecast out. You know, you say 10, I say 12, you say 12, I say 15, you know. So but what I look at is actually,
so just to come back to that, if I may, yeah, what we're trying to do with Neon is basically we're going to tell each other stories, right, of how you want the future to be, but then we have to make them work in a quantified model. And actually that's pretty hard. Most stories you pull out of your head, actually you can't make them work if you really try to get input from all experts. But if you can get them to work, if you find a really thrilling story, and if you can get it to work in, for example, our Neon model, then you're sitting on something.
Right. No, and that's great, because then the numbers still add up. I mean, I'm just looking, you know, I'm just a little bit allergic to Seba, because in his modeling, what he said was that the ratio, battery costs are going to go down, and the ratio between the battery and the car stays the same. So a car ends up costing, you know, a Mercedes, you know, that 7-seat SUV or sort of ends up costing $5,000 or $10,000. I mean, it's just stupid stuff. And it makes it very difficult for us. You know, we're trying to be serious, and it makes it harder.
Yeah, I think Seba is absolutely visionary. He's very good at framing stuff that I think a lot of people are sort of latching onto, and it's directionally right. But his quantifications, I cannot agree with. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So let's move on, because otherwise I'll have to think of other nasty things to say about him. But one of the things that you get a lot of pushback. So this idea that solar, and of course, to a lesser extent, wind, but also, I'm working with this company Ever, and it's geothermal. They will also have a learning curve. It's heavy engineering, it's a bit different, but batteries, there will be these learning curves, and it will look more like IT than it looks like oil, gas, coal, and so on. Some people really find it difficult to get their heads around that. And they start talking about things like energy return on energy invested. And there's always a subtext behind it.
Yes. By the way, one quick anecdote that I really like. I know a good friend who his company has coined the term Wi-Fi. So he was ahead of the curve, and he sold it, and he's and then another friend, he started the first ISP in the Netherlands, and they said to me, explain to us the energy transition. So I prepared a very, very big presentation, and after 3 minutes they said, yeah, we get it, can we just skip the slides ourselves? And they went through all the slides of my 45-minute presentation in 3 minutes and said, yeah, all completely plain. So this is sort of a very extreme example to me, and a very humbling example of how normal this cutting edge energy transition thinking is for visionaries in ICT. They really get it. So just to underscore your point.
That's right. And, and of course, if you go off to California, then they'll talk about singularities, what you call tipping points, singularities. And it is a very natural vocabulary for somebody who has not been educated in, oil, gas, coal, nuclear.
Exactly. But okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
On energy return, I want to just, because we started, that's one of the objections that's raised. But I think you did some stuff looking at, well, the solar panels can make the solar panels.
And I almost thought, have I inspired Elon Musk? Because he was saying it at Battery Day. Probably not. Probably it's independent thinking. But he also said it. If we start making solar panels using solar panels, and windmills using windmills, and we use those for the mines and for the factories, our emissions can basically go to zero. So that's a very important sort of mental model, that CO2 emissions, if you use renewable technology to produce renewable technology, you can get extremely close to zero. So basically forget CO2 if you will. But then energy return on investment. I've never understood how so many people can fall for that, because it's completely clear that if you take the energy influx of the sun into the Earth system, that all the foundational works around energy return on investment, they become bollocks, to use your term, right? It's nonsense. And then if you look more closely, you basically see that they're sort of very, I think, emotionally attached to this idea that growth must be finite. So basically they're degrowth disciples, right? Who use energy return on investment as a way to sort of give some sort of scientific source to their thinking. But it's simply not true.
The energy return on energy investment, I've usually had thrown at me by nuclear fans. So not degrowthers, they may use it as well, but I've had it because nuclear, they say, oh, well, it's got a 60x return, and let's say solar has got a 20x, so nuclear must be better. And of course, a 20x return over a 20-year lifetime and a 60x return over a 60x lifetime are identical. They are dynamically identical.
Yes.
And because what's important is not the ER, it's not the energy return, it's the energy return per year. And it doesn't drive me crazy. I just feel sorry for them. I feel sorry for people who raise this stuff without understanding how stupid it sounds.
But do you have the feeling that there are also, let's say, academic luminaries who throw at issue, or is this simply?
It's people who are not thinking. They're not thinking for themselves. They're just using a meme, and it could be academics, or it could be Twitterati, but they're not they're not really thinking. And also, I think what they're doing, essentially what's happening is it's motivated reason. You know, they've decided they like thorium, and so then they'll use whatever. And some others, I mean, to come back to the degrowth, the degrowthers, I mean, that one is usually the way usually it's about how much material is used, sort of how much copper, how much glass, how much of everything. And that is something that I think that a lot of clean energy, you know, fans haven't yet got their head around, and they need to, that this transition is going to involve a lot of mining.
Exactly.
It's
and I think, by the way,
ultimately everything will be recycled and you can stop mining. But in the interim, the next few decades, going to be a lot of mining. Get over it. Do it properly. Do it ethically. But there's going to be a lot of mining.
Exactly. And exactly, that's also where I'm sort of directing everybody in Neon and around it now. And I say CO2, we're managing that. We're going too slow. We have to speed it up. But this is, let's say, philosophically, we sort of solved that. We're not there yet by any, especially you mentioned.
We're near peak emissions is my thesis, and
we'll manage. Yeah. We have to go down much quicker, but this is sort of, we'll in the end we'll get very close to zero emissions, but we'll not get very close to zero resources in a very, very long time. On the contrary, the resource use will go up. So I think the biggest wins right now are to be made in more sustainable mining, basically, because often even small changing, or at least cost-wise, small changing to mining practices can often bring enormous differences in terms of environmental impact. And basically, by the way, below resource use is biodiversity. If you use a lot of resources, for example, from a mine, which basically is in the middle of nowhere, and if you dig harder, the surface area, for example, of the mine more or less stays the same, it's no problem. The problem arises, and there's some very good recent literature on this, when you open new mines everywhere, and for example, close to natural areas, and you do this without thinking through what your impact will be, because often you can limit this impact quite easily. And this is really something that, for example, the European Union and Great Britain, hopefully together still, can sort of push towards, because it's super important.
Very interesting. I don't know if you noticed that I've been appointed to the Board of Trade, or as advisor to the Board of Trade. And these issues are, I have to get my head around what we can do, because obviously, you know, whether we're importing finished goods or raw materials, the terms under which we do it need to be, I don't know, the question is, do you build them into your trade deals, or do you deal with them separately, but still aggressively? Because we can't just let, you know, we can't just say, well, we're all virtuous, we're going to net zero, but there's these horrible things happening in South America, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia, or wherever.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think...
And it must be, you know, coming back to the, you know, degrowthers, you know, it's kind of, you know, it is amazing how people almost decide whether they are pro-thorium, anti-capitalists, or pro, you know, sort of technology-enabled human progress, and then everything else is sort of just fits in. You know, people are not solving like your models. They don't just let the thoughts and the data go and sort of let the answers emerge, do they?
No, I find that a lot of people are extremely invested in being pro or anti-capitalism, pro or anti-growth, pro or anti-technology, and on a deep level, I've never understood this. For me, it's very simple. We have to improve happiness and reduce suffering. And I want to make life on Earth, basically help life on Earth in all its diversity, stay healthy, stay the same. So these are my basic goals. And anything that helps in that direction is okay with me. And if more technology doesn't work, it doesn't work.
But what's great about what you do, and the reason that so many paths lead to you and your work, is that you just relentlessly expose the figures. I get involved in some of the kind of, I sometimes call it culture hacking, but it's basically getting into arguments, right? You know, with RCP 8.5, this absurd scenario from the IPCC, I started the hashtag RCP 8.5 is bollocks, because you were just, you know, trying with people that I consider to have left rational thought long before. You were still trying to argue, not argue, but discuss. And another one I want to bring up, actually, I don't want to go down the RCP 8.5 rabbit hole too much. The one recently that you have been brilliant at you know, informing was internal combustion engines versus electric, where some people are so invested in, I don't know what, resisting something, that they, you know, will produce these very biased, well, not very, I mean, you tell me, what were they producing? How did you deal with it?
Yeah, no, actually, yeah. So what I did a couple of times now, and I think it's one of my most valuable contributions, even though it's intellectually boring by now, is basically every time someone comes out with a study saying, yes, but electric vehicles, when you look at everything, they actually emit more CO2, to basically squash that, to basically swat that every single time. Very, very, very boring. But it's easier. But
so this is electric vehicles are, you know, emit more on a whole life cycle basis than diesel. And how many times have we seen that? How many times have you seen the story?
Well, very often, but I think there's about 6 or 7 serious studies that I try to debunk, basically.
Yeah.
But if I may, so I think most people by now get that battery production is emitting less and less and less CO2, that the grid is greening continuously, and for that reason, that basically the only scenario at least in the future, most people get that to get to low CO2 is either electric or hydrogen. Maybe you can look into that later. But what I would also like to use this podcast for is to point out that I've been very much into trucks, you know, electric trucks.
Right.
And for 5 years or so, I've been looking for the reason that electric vehicles, electric cars, yeah, that will work. But electric trucks, that's something different. And for 5 years, I've been talking to everybody, basically asking them, so what makes trucks so special? Why can't it work for trucks? Right. And I've never, ever gotten a good answer. And I've done a couple of studies myself. I have 5 master students now who did parts for me. And basically, my conclusion is that if you electrify a truck thoroughly, then the weight you gain by changing in the drivetrain, the diesel drivetrain and the tank for the electric drivetrain plus the battery, that in 4 or 5 years, that's basically a wash.
A wash, right. So just to complete on the in case anybody who is new to this didn't quite follow, you've essentially proven and you've debunked repeatedly that it's simply not true that diesel is better than EV. You've debunked that completely. Right? Just in case anybody didn't pick that up in this conversation. Right?
Yes. Just go to Twitter, vehicles. Auke Hoekstra, and you will just go to Twitter, Auke Hoekstra, and I can convince you there. Yeah.
And you've been recognized. You know, I think it was it VW, the CEO of. I mean, people have referred to your stuff now at the very highest levels. You've kind of won.
I really love the fact that 2 weeks ago that Mr. Dies, who is the CEO of Volkswagen, which is now the biggest car maker in the world, at least in terms of number of vehicles, basically said, listen to this guy because he knows where his towel is.
Okay, but now you've got this other campaign.
Crusade.
I'm going to call it a campaign because they are like campaigns.
Crusade.
And that is, I don't use the word crusade because it's got implications on, but a campaign.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Right? Yeah, you're right.
Just, you know, I don't go there, so that's easy.
Campaign.
And this is about electrification of trucks. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why I think you get so much pushback. It is from the hydrogen fuel cell car brigade. And they have, because that was one we have also interacted on, that it's now, I think, finally, my campaign was to get people to understand that a hydrogen fuel cell car for most use cases is absolutely foolish, very inefficient, very complicated, makes you go and, you know, to hydrogen fueling stations every week, which don't even exist, rather than charging in the home, et cetera, et cetera. But now the Hydrogen Brigade have decided that trucks can only possibly be done via hydrogen. And I think that's why they push back when you say, oh no, actually they work just fine, you know, the same as a car, as a light vehicle. I think that's why you get that pushback.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think also because they sort of accepted that they can't have cars, so they at least want to have trucks. Yeah. But I'm sorry, they can't have trucks, and not because I say so, because reality says so.
Okay, so let's do the truck thing in a bit more detail now. What you're saying, because the argument that always comes, oh no, the battery is too heavy. Yeah, exactly. Right? The battery is too heavy. You couldn't possibly do a big vehicle. The battery is too heavy. And then what you've said is that
So I say, first of all, you have to understand that people are always comparing with diesel that can go, let's say, 2,000 kilometers and then quickly take more diesel, and you can go through all of Europe continuously driving. And if you can't replicate that, you don't have a good product. And now with hydrogen, maybe you can sort of get into directionally into the same area. But what I first found out, also a couple of years ago, so still fresh, is that actually most trucks drive between 500 and 750 kilometers a day, and then they get back to where they started. So that's 80% of trucks. They drive 500 to 750.
And this is heavy vehicles. I mean, all the delivery vans, all the smaller ones don't even do that. Yeah, they do 100 miles. They do nothing.
I'm just talking about the 40 tons, the big ones.
Right.
Because actually most CO2 is emitted, most diesel is used in the transport, in the freight sector by these big ones. And these other ones are also nice, but they're basically, either they follow cars, they're basically cars with a loading area, or they are in between the big trucks and the cars. And this in-between category, with all due respect, is a small category. So I'm focusing on the big ones.
The big rigs, the big rigs, as they call them.
Exactly, the 18-wheelers, that sort of stuff. Actually, most of the diesel is burned in those vehicles if you look at freight. And it has always been sort of the dogma that those vehicles, they cannot be electrified. And first thing I found out is they drive 500 to 750 kilometers a day, almost never more. So let's say 10-20% drive more, but almost never more. And usually they come back to the same place where they started. The truck driver simply goes home to mama or papa, whatever, and eats, and the next day is another day. So this whole idea of the trucker, going through all of Europe and getting away from home for 6 weeks is actually a small percentage of truckers. Most truckers go from Rotterdam, for example, to Venlo, to the south of the Netherlands. There they are repacked, and then they go to another area, which is, let's say, 200-300 kilometers further, and that's it. So if you know that you don't need a battery for 2,000 kilometers. It's simply not a business case for that. If you have a battery for 750 kilometers, even if you cannot fast charge, right? Even if you have no charging infrastructure at all on the road, then 750 kilometers is fine. Great. 80% of trucks, that's enough. So then you start to look, okay, for those 80% of trucks, so forget the 20%, those 80% of trucks, how much does it weigh to have a battery that can go 750 kilometers? And at the end of the day, if you also look at the fact that they are often driving empty, they're driving back often empty, etc., then the average energy use is about 1.3 kilowatt hours per kilometer. So you end up with about 1 megawatt hour batteries, big batteries. I agree. But
that's like 10 Teslas.
Exactly.
10 Tesla S's.
10 big Teslas. Yeah, exactly. So then you're into the category of, right now, I would say 4,500 kilograms, 4.5 tons. But in the future, if Battery Day, for example, pans out, or a number of other companies which are doing the same pan out, you actually get below 3,500 kilograms for a battery of 1 megawatt hour. And then you look at the drivetrain and you see, wait, if you place electric motors between the wheels, instead of going the route with a very long drive shaft and a differential and all that sort of stuff, which is actually pretty heavy if you have a 40-ton truck, then you can save about 3,000 to 3,500 kilograms just from changing the drivetrain to electric that way. So that basically means that in 4 or 5 years, we can have a drivetrain, a complete assembly that weighs the same. Now, if you, so basically just to finish this then, to make sure that the readers understand, in 4 to 5 years, basically if we use the current technology that is being used in cars and would transplant that to trucks, which is not being done at the moment, but just imagine that we use simply car technology in trucks. Then we would have trucks that weigh the same and can go this 750 kilometers. And they are about 1/3 of the cost per kilometer in terms of, so that's a very good business case.
And more pleasant to drive, because the London taxis that are electric, you talk to the drivers, they would never go back to a diesel because of the vibrations and the unpleasantness.
Exactly. And at a traffic light, you are much faster at a traffic light, for example, which is also nice if you're a truck driver.
Yeah. I'm fascinated whenever it comes to this. I'm always fascinated by what does it do to the grid? And of course, the other thing you've got, even if a driver is driving those 2,000 kilometers, the driver still only has the same size bladder as you or I. And in fact, regulation means they have to stop. So if you do have rapid charging, then even the 2,000 kilometer journey becomes feasible.
Exactly. In Europe, every 4.5 hours, you have to have a break of 45 minutes.
And you could charge a truck, but it's then you need megawatts of charging, right?
Exactly. So what I always like to say is to point out to people, sorry to sort of go astray there, that those fast chargers, they're important, but they're not that important. Actually, right. For most trucks, if they can get home basically to where they started, which most trucks do, then overnight you can charge them, and then let's say 50 kilowatt charger. It's a fast charger for cars, but for a truck that would be a slow charger. But anyway, such a charger would sort of, you have to go 10 times as fast because 10 times as big because the battery is 10 times as large. So 50 kilowatt charger.
Well, if you had a megawatt of battery, that would be 20 hours. So you need a bit more than 50.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
You might need a couple. But I think the other thing that was interesting, I think you and I also, we interacted with Siemens, and then there's a very brilliant Cambridge professor called David Seaborn, who's been looking at using catenaries. And I think one could also do the work on contactless charging, because my thesis is that the way this is likely to go is all urban transport, all of it goes electric. Buses, cars, taxi, the whole lot. I think so too. Delivery, etc. And all of the large trucks that are just going, sort of around the periphery of the city. So now each city is going to be effectively electric. So London will be electric, Manchester will be electric, Birmingham will be electric, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and so on. And so now if you want to drive a truck between them, why wouldn't you just have if you have to, why don't you just put some catenaries up the M1 and you're done? Why would you have a whole different fleet of hydrogen fuel cell trucks with all of their stations and hydrogen and complexity, and the workshops will have 2 sorts of trucks to deal with, one that does these deliveries and one that does that delivery every so often. So it just feels like the simplest solution is going to be just electric everywhere. Just electric everywhere.
Can I react to that in 2 parts? Yeah. Because you're basically raising 2 points. You're raising catenaries now and fuel cells. And for the fuel cells, I would like to make 2 points very quickly. The first is that for trucks, actually, fuel cells are more problematic. People don't understand that, but are more problematic because even though they're lighter, so that's true. Simply, if you have a 1 megawatt hour battery and you replace it with the equivalent in hydrogen tanks, so to speak, they are lighter. That's true. But they are much more voluminous.
You're
And
right.
if you go with the current setup, which is very ingrained in the industry of the semi, of the tractor and the trailer, which
The
are
tractor
independent
unit.
of each other,
Yeah.
then you have to find a way to put everything you take with you in the tractor. And actually, putting another 3,500 kilograms of battery in a tractor, as I just described, is no problem at all, because you can actually save that kind of weight in the drivetrain. Now, you can be a little bit lighter, theoretically speaking, if you take hydrogen, but where the hell do you get the room to put all that hydrogen? So actually, it's not that simple to go hydrogen. But apart from hydrogen being relatively inefficient, relatively expensive, and voluminous, catenary, right? I've always thought that catenary is sort of the ideal solution, but I'm also a bit skeptical to the migration path, because will people like those? Basically, the technology is simple. We're doing this with trains for a very long time now, so it's not rocket science at all. But what you sketch, for example, cars having a way to reach up 3.5 meters or something, 4.5 meters probably.
I don't think catenary would be for cars. I think it would be buses and trucks. And my concern is we're running out of time. We're going to have to come back and do more of this at a later date, because, I look at it and say, well, if you combine catenary charging or contactless charging with driverless, if I say, if you throw this thing up the M1 and it can charge as it goes, and if that driver, I'm not a big believer in driverless taxis. I don't know if we'll ever see the full taxi bot, but if a driver going on a motorway can go into a platoon and just follow the truck in front or the bus in front, then I think that's where it's going to, and then the catenary makes sense, because what you don't want is drivers falling asleep and pulling the wires down and doing all sorts of stuff. So I'm reasonably sure that solution will beat anything else, cost-wise, effectiveness-wise, efficiency of use of electricity, of renewable clean energy, and so on.
I think the biggest advantage of catenary systems is that you need much less resources. You need much smaller batteries. That's, I think, the biggest advantage. And the second advantage is, of course, that you need, basically lose no time whatsoever for charging. So that makes them very interesting.
And I mean, we must never forget, and we just never lose an opportunity to say, you don't waste half of your electricity going from electricity to hydrogen and then from hydrogen back to electricity, which is the stupidest thing, but that sensible people seem quite happy to consider.
Exactly. There's one, sorry to complicate things, one sort of exception. If we ever make a pipeline or something like that from, for example, Morocco or places where there is lots of solar and lots of room to here, then you could basically take the same solar panels, put them there, have them be twice as effective there, and pump the hydrogen over. So,
except it'll be cheaper to build a cable and bring the electricity in. But you don't have to believe me, because you're building the agent-based models that will answer all these questions.
Exactly.
So actually, I shouldn't be saying things like that. I should be saying, well, I really want to know what NEON is going to come up with. I hope that you're going to do the difficult sectors, heating. I hope you're going to do shipping. I hope you're going to do the heavy transportation. I hope you're going to do the glass industry, and all sorts of difficult to decarbonize sectors. But we won't be able to cover them today, because unfortunately we're sort of running out of time.
Maybe I should come back in 1 year or something when we have some new answers.
I think that would be an absolutely excellent idea, particularly if I'm still doing cleaning up, which I don't see any reason why I wouldn't be.
You will be.
My goal is to do one a week, and hopefully not run out of friends, but you'll always be welcome back. So with that, I'm going to thank you for spending time this evening with me here. And I wish you best of luck with your 35 PhDs and brilliant geniuses that are modeling, building that Holland simulator so that we can all learn from it.
Thank you very much, Michael. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Auke. Good night.
Good night.
So that was Auke Hoekstra, researcher at the Technical University of Eindhoven. And next time you're on Twitter and you're getting into an argument about electric vehicles, electric trucks, growth rates of renewable energy, solar in particular, look out for him. I'll give you his handle. It's at Auke Hoekstra. We'll put a link in the show notes. My guest next week on Cleaning Up worked his way up the system at the UN, becoming Director General of UNIDO. At that point, he was tasked by the Secretary General of the UN to pull together all of the UN's activities around energy. He did it with great vision, great passion, and that resulted in the creation of SE for All, and then eventually became what we now know as SDG 7, the Sustainable Development Goal 7. Please join me next week for my conversation with Kande Yamkela.